The Pharisees were an important religious group during ancient times in Israel, especially during the period of the New Testament in the Bible. They were known for being very dedicated to the practice of the Jewish religion and the interpretation of the law of Moses. The Pharisees taught that it was crucial to follow not only the written law, but also the oral law, which was a tradition passed down from generation to generation. They believed that this oral tradition contained additional teachings and explanations that helped people understand and practice the law more deeply. Additionally, the Pharisees emphasized the importance of ethics and morality in daily life. They encouraged people to live according to the principles of justice, compassion, and love for one another. The Pharisees were also known for being active in the community, engaging in charitable activities and helping those in need. However, despite their religious zeal, the Pharisees were often criticized by Jesus and others for their hypocrisy and excessive rigidity in religious matters. But it is important to note that not all Pharisees were the same, and some of them were seen as pious and just individuals. In summary, the Pharisees were an influential religious group that valued strict observance of Jewish law, moral ethics, and community service. A lot of people talk about the Pharisees, but not everyone really understands who they were and what they did. In this video, we'll discover more about their true story. The Pharisees were a group of people who were part of a party among the Jews in ancient times, and they are quite famous for appearing frequently in the New Testament, mainly because they weren't big fans of what Jesus was doing. They were kind of one of the three most important groups among the Jews, along with the Sadducees and the Essenes. These people we're about to meet dedicated their lives to wholeheartedly following God. They fought against a king named Antiochus. In this video, we're going to understand exactly who they were and what they represented. So, let's go and find out more about these people who left their mark on ancient history. Take a moment to check if you're already subscribed to the Bible Stories channel. I hope these videos inspire you and give you a deeper understanding of the stories that have influenced people throughout the ages. These Bible stories have timeless lessons, offering guidance, comfort, and wisdom for those who seek them. May they inspire and guide you as you grow and learn in life. Keep an eye out for more exciting stories that reveal important truths hidden within the pages of the Bible. The Pharisees are a group of people mentioned in the New Testament, and they're quite complicated to understand. They often clashed with Jesus, which caused a lot of confusion and debate. But who were these guys? Well, they were an important group during a time called the intertestamental period, which is when a lot of things happened before the New Testament began. They also played a big role in shaping Judaism as we know it today. But, let's get into it. What did they do? Well, they had a unique way of living and taught a lot of things. But Jesus wasn't a big fan of what they did and taught. So you might be thinking, were all the Pharisees the same? Not exactly. They had their differences, but many of them ended up being viewed negatively by a lot of people. So, there you have it, the Pharisees are one of those groups that are kind of complicated to understand, but it's important to know a bit about them to better understand the history of Jesus' time and how Judaism developed. Firstly, it's important to understand why this group was called Pharisees. We encounter a challenge here in defining exactly what this term means. The most accepted interpretation suggests that it comes from a Hebrew word meaning to separate or divide. If this interpretation is correct, then the term Pharisee indicates the idea of separation or distinction. Possibly, this group became known in this way because people started seeing them as separatists, a different and distinct people from the others. But let's get into it. What does it really mean to be a Pharisee? That's a tough question because there's no definitive answer. Some say the Pharisees wanted to distance themselves from certain practices, influences, or groups. But what exactly does this separation mean, reflected in the group's name, can't be stated with certainty. Some people think it's about staying away from impure things and uncool customs. Others think it might have to do with politics or differences in practices and beliefs. In fact, throughout history, the Pharisees distanced themselves from various things, like the house of Hassan. So, it's kind of tricky to understand exactly what all this means, but it's interesting to think about it. During the time between the Old and New Testaments, there was a group of people in Judea called the Pharisees. They were quite different from the others. While many people were blending in with Greek culture, the Pharisees preferred to keep things more old-fashioned, closely following the commandments and laws of Moses. They sort of isolated themselves from other Jews who didn't place as much importance on these things. So, basically, the Pharisees were like a group that wanted to follow religious rules very strictly and not mix with the cultural changes of the time. It's like they were the guardians of the ancient traditions of the Jewish people. They were good at interpreting religious rules. This kind of made them seen as the masters of these laws. Some think the name Pharisee comes from a word meaning to separate, but others say it comes from a word meaning Persian. Kind of strange, right? But then comes a connection with Zoroastrianism, an ancient religion practiced by the Persians. Some scholars think the Pharisees took some ideas from this religion. So, it's a pretty interesting story of how these names and ideas might have mixed up back then. The Pharisees might have gotten this name because some people thought they followed ideas from the Persians, from ancient Persia. And that might even explain why they didn't get along too well with the Sadducees, who were like the Jewish elite at the time, you know? Now, when we talk about where the Pharisees came from, there are several theories, but no definite one. Some think they started way back, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, who were people who returned from the Babylonian exile and wanted to keep the old traditions, without mixing with the pagan things people had adopted out there. It's like they were the guardians of Jewish traditions. Others think the Pharisees might have emerged among the scribes, who were like scholars of Moses' law, wanting to continue the work Ezra had started. And also among those who took following all the rules very seriously. But what seems more likely is that the Pharisees appeared before a revolt called the Maccabean Revolt. They sort of emerged to fight against Greek cultural influences, closely following Moses' law. So, the Hasidim, who were people super dedicated to Moses' law and led resistance against the Greeks, were probably the first Pharisees. It's like they were the heroes who wanted to keep the old traditions alive. Let's talk about a group called the Hasidim. They led a revolt but preferred to focus on religious life rather than politics. Because of this, the group split, and various Jewish sects emerged, including the Pharisees. The Pharisees, in a way, followed in the footsteps of the Hasidim, who were very dedicated to Jewish laws and traditions. They were known not only for being very strict in their religious practices but also for being critical of many things. It's interesting how different groups emerged because of these ideas. One thing that made the Pharisees different from other people who also followed Moses' law was that they took this oral law very seriously. They believed that this law, passed down orally, was as important as the written Torah itself, which is like the Bible to them. This oral law probably began to develop when the Jews were in the Babylonian exile. They wanted to remain faithful to Moses' law, so they began to write explanations and commentaries to ensure that everything was followed correctly. Over time, these explanations became more complicated and increasingly detailed. Around 200 AD, all this oral law was compiled into a book, which contained a bunch of legal rules and teachings. So, the Pharisees were like the masters of these traditions and teachings. Let's talk about how Jewish leaders were becoming increasingly involved in politics at the time when the Pharisees first appeared. These Pharisees were a group mentioned by a historian named Flavius Josephus, and they were seen alongside the Sadducees, who were other Jewish leaders. An important Jewish leader at that time was John Hyrcanus, who ruled between 3 and 105 BC. At first, he was friendly with the Pharisees but ended up distancing himself from them after an incident at a banquet. During the banquet, a man said that John was not worthy of being the high priest, and this caused a lot of turmoil. This episode marked the beginning of a change in relations between the Pharisees and other Jewish leaders. It's interesting to see how politics and personal relationships can influence history so much. Let's talk about a time of great tension between the Pharisees, who were religious leaders, and the Jewish political leaders, who favored the Sadducees. This happened during the rule of two men named Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus, who were sons of a man named John Herod. Despite all this turmoil, the Pharisees continued to have a lot of influence among the common people. They were known for being very dedicated to Jewish traditions and law. This influence of the Pharisees only grew even more when Alexander Jannaeus' wife began to get involved. She made an alliance with them to try to keep things more stable. It's impressive how these religious leaders had so much power. Let's talk about a time when the Pharisees were at the top, controlling important decisions both in politics and religion. It was like they were the bosses, making all the important decisions. But after Alexandra died and her two sons began to fight for power, the Pharisees saw their political power diminish. Especially when the son named Aristobulus took the throne, supported by the Sadducees. Even so, the Pharisees were still important to the people, despite all these changes in politics and the increasing pressure from the Romans. Even the next ruler, Herod, who didn't care much for the teachings of the Pharisees, couldn't take away all their importance to the people. It's interesting to see how power can change so quickly. Let's talk about how people viewed the Pharisees at that time. They were important and popular, so everyone knew it was better to maintain a good relationship with them. But unlike the Sadducees, who were more focused on politics, the Pharisees were like bookworms, you know? They organized themselves differently. Most Pharisees were traders and businessmen, but they were very dedicated to Jewish laws. They followed these laws very closely. The Pharisees were different from the common people because they were very strict in following all religious traditions. Even though most of them hadn't studied much about the laws, they were very serious about obeying them. It's interesting to see how people were different. I'm going to talk about how seriously the Pharisees took their religious practices. They not only followed the laws but also sought guidance from people called scribes, who were experts in legal matters. Among the Pharisees, there were also priests and Levites, who were types of religious leaders, but they were fewer in number. The Pharisees organized themselves into closed groups, usually located on the outskirts of Jerusalem, which made them very influential. To enter these groups, people needed to follow very strict rules, such as practicing tithing, undergoing purification rituals, participating in special ceremonies, and even following specific diets. It was like they were a club with very serious rules. Let's talk about how people became true Pharisees. Before becoming full members of the community, they underwent a testing period, where they were evaluated to see if they were ready to take on all the responsibilities and benefits. The leaders of these communities chose some people to be responsible for authoritatively interpreting the law and assisting with important matters. These groups not only served as a place to discuss ideas and support each other but also organized regular religious activities. They would meet regularly, especially on Saturdays, to study the Torah and share meals together. Additionally, these communities also provided an environment where people could feel part of something bigger and connect with their faith on a deeper level. Let's talk about how the Pharisees managed to reach many people through the synagogues. These places were like centers where people gathered to learn about the Torah and engage in charitable activities. Being involved in the synagogues allowed the ideas of the Pharisees to reach many people in the Jewish community. Many of these people liked the Pharisees' ideas, even without officially becoming members of the Pharisaic communities. Now, you must be wondering about what the Pharisees taught, right? They were known for being very strict in following not only the written law but also the oral traditions passed down from generation to generation. It was as if they were masters at keeping traditions alive. Let's talk about an interesting thing that the Pharisees taught. They said that besides the written law, which everyone knew about, there was also an oral law. They claimed that this oral law had been passed down from generation to generation since the time of Ezra, who was a very important figure in Jewish history. They even said that this tradition came from the ancient prophets, like Joshua, and went all the way to Moses, who is considered one of the greatest leaders in Jewish history. The Pharisees took this oral law very seriously. To them, it was as important as the written law, if not more. They made sure to follow these rules very strictly and placed a lot of value on them. It was as if they wanted to keep alive all the tradition and wisdom of the ancients. To conclude our video, we can reflect on the legacy of the Pharisees and their enduring influence. Although often portrayed negatively, the Pharisees played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Jewish religious traditions. Their commitment to the observance of both written and oral law reflects a deep desire to keep alive the spiritual identity of their people. Additionally, the Pharisees' emphasis on ethics and morality offers valuable lessons on the importance of living with integrity and compassion. Though they emerged thousands of years ago, the lessons of the Pharisees remain relevant today, inspiring us to seek a life of meaning and moral responsibility. In a world where religious and cultural differences often divide people, the Pharisees remind us of the importance of keeping faith and tradition alive while promoting respect and mutual understanding. Their practices and teachings challenge us to reflect on our own beliefs and how we live our lives. As we continue our journey of discovery and learning, we can find inspiration in the legacy of the Pharisees to shape a future that is more compassionate and inclusive for all. May we apply these lessons in our daily lives, contributing to a more harmonious and respectful world. The Pharisees were an influential religious group in Judaism during ancient times, especially during the New Testament period in the Bible. They were known for their devotion to the practice of Judaism and the interpretation of Moses' law. The word Pharisee is derived from a Hebrew word meaning separate or divide, suggesting that they valued distinction and separation to maintain religious purity. The Pharisees were distinct for their strict and comprehensive interpretation of Jewish religious laws, including not only the written law but also the oral tradition. They believed in the importance of not only following external rules but also living according to the ethical and moral principles of the religion. For example, they emphasized charity, honesty, and compassion as fundamental parts of their faith. Despite their reputation for religious rigor, the Pharisees were not homogeneous in their beliefs and practices. There were different views and interpretations within the group. Some Pharisees were seen as hypocrites and legalists, while others were praised for their integrity and piety. The Pharisees also played an important role in preserving Jewish religious traditions during a period of political change and challenge, especially during Roman rule in Palestine. Their influence extended beyond the synagogues, where they taught and led, reaching into people's everyday lives. However, they were also subject to criticism, especially by Jesus Christ, who confronted them for their hypocrisy and excessive legalism. The rivalry between Jesus and the Pharisees is well documented in the New Testament Gospels. Despite criticisms and controversies, the legacy of the Pharisees continues to be studied and debated to this day, as their practices and teachings have left a lasting mark on Judaism and the understanding of human spirituality.